Not so bad. Thank you. And now to the papers as usual. And unfortunately, it has become clear that Tina Brown won't make it into the studio this morning. She got stuck in traffic. She heroically threw herself into the underground, but it still hasn't worked. In the meantime, our political correspondent, Susana Mendoza, has heroically stepped into the breach. Thank you very much indeed. And Fraser Nelson is here. Front pages, just a few things to say. An astonishing story here about Tom Watson, who led the paedophile case issue very, very controversially. It turns out that his uncle was a child abuser and was sentenced for that. Politically, by all standards, the most significant story of the day, I think, is the Sunday Telegraph story. 4 key demands to remain in the EU. Over the next week, this is what people are going to be talking about. Are they tough enough? Are they strong enough? Or is David Cameron beginning to soften up the Conservative Party and public opinion for something less than he'd originally promised? Finally, the Sunday Times in good form, talking about the people who are going to lead the campaign to stay in Europe. All 3 surviving prime ministers who aren't themselves prime ministers are going to be involved in it. Quite an establishment group, but quite an interesting story there. And Jeremy Corbyn. Everyone's been hunting Jeremy Corbyn. Where was he when he wasn't seeing the Queen? The answer was he was outside a pub in Scotland on a walking holiday. So lots to talk about. Thank you both very much indeed. Fraser, let's start with you. That Sunday Telegraph story. Explain why I'm so excited about it to the viewers, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, the great question of the EU debate is, what does David Cameron want? When he goes to do this great renegotiation that he's promised us, what's he going to come back with? And it's not just Brits are wondering this, but most people, prime ministers in Europe are wondering, what does he want? They try to find out, and he doesn't say. Well, Tim Ross from the Sunday Telegraph has found the 4 demands. One of them is that Britain will be kept out of a European superstate. Well, we've got that already. The so-called triple lock is supposed to assure us of it. The second one is that they want a statement saying that the euro is not the currency of the EU. Well, we know that. We've got sterling, we've got kroner in Sweden, you know.
So that status quo stuff as far as you're concerned.
And so they continue. I mean, a red card system where the parliaments might be able to bring back power from Brussels, but maybe not.
But you need
really.
lots of parliaments, or some parliaments working together. So it's not the British Parliament getting power back.
Yeah, you need, the idea is, say you get 10 or 12 parliaments to get together saying, right, we want this power back. The EU would have to say yes. This is a Dutch idea. But you don't need treaty change for that. It could happen tomorrow, nothing stopping.
And the final demand?
A new structure for the EU whereby the Eurozone countries are in a different zone to those outside the Eurozone. Well, that wouldn't make a blind bit of difference. So in other words, there is nothing in here at all of any substance.
And what is missing, Fraser? You said there's no treaty change there, but also there's no mention of free movement of peoples, and there's nothing about the benefits that workers coming into this country get.
Yeah, just a few months ago, we were told that the tax credits, right now you have to subsidise wages for Spanish unemployed as well as British. That would stop. We'd only give tax credits to the Brits. Well, no sign of that. And then, of course, free movement of people, the border situation, which is of increasing concern during the refugee crisis, nothing on that either. So anything that you might think Europe could give back doesn't seem to be on the menu. And it seems that the Out campaign are far more coherent, they're far more together, and it seems that they might have the momentum.
Now, The Spectator has been very, very balanced on this issue over the past weeks and months. In your judgment, is this a package that David Cameron is going to be able to sell to the Conservative Party?
Well, the great thing about this is that the Tories aren't the main actor here. If you've got a referendum, it's about selling it to the public. Now, the polls show that the support for the EU membership had been going up, but they've been coming down in the light of the EU crisis, when you can see the whole project kind of disintegrate. And it's David Cameron's duty to sell it to the average concerned voter. Right now, it'll come down to the strength of the campaign. Now, as somebody who followed the Scottish campaign very closely, I'm worried that the In campaign is going to be the same as Better Together.
Project Fear.
Project Fear, saying that you're too small, too poor, we need to be part of a big group to go together. Voters don't like that.
They certainly don't.
And if there's one thing they really don't like, is having the likes of Gordon Brown, Tony Blair and John Major, the Sunday Times says they're going to front the campaign. Well, there's a reason that they're ex-prime ministers, and that's because public were fed up with them.
Speaking of politicians, Suzanne, we've put you on the spot. I'm very, very kind of you to jump in at the last minute.
Glad to be here.
The Mail on Sunday story here, Tom Watson. Now, he's the deputy leader of the of the Labour Party, not the deputy leader of the Mail on Sunday, so far as I'm aware, of the Labour Party, but a very important figure.
Yeah, and what they're talking about here is that Tom Watson, who many may know, has been somebody who has spoken out against historic child abuse time and again over the past few years. Well, he accused Lord Britton of child abuse and
used very strong language. He talked about evil and so on.
Described him as being evil. Used very strong language, and it transpires that Lord Britton was not found guilty of any of these charges. And the Mail is saying that Tom Watson was basically on a witch hunt, and are saying that he took it too far, really. Now Tom Watson has apologised. Of course, now he's the deputy leader of the Labour Party, so he's in a much more prominent position than he was in previously when he was campaigning against child sex abuse.
Absolutely right. And so, Fraser, this is not newspapers going for a relatively anonymous backbench MP who's got something wrong about child abuse. This is actually politically very significant, isn't it?
It is, because right now Jeremy Corbyn has shown he's not really a very active leader. He's happy to let his people do what they want. When Tom Watson is positioning himself as the sort of the chief executive to Jeremy Corbyn's chairman. So this makes him a far greater political target, but it's not just the papers that are going for him. The Sunday Times today says that Keith Vaz, who's the chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, a Labour MP, wants to have him grilled before that committee and say, why did you stand up in Parliament on live TV and say that there was clear evidence of a paedophile conspiracy when there was no such evidence? So even his own party, who don't like him very much anyway, seem to be going for him. So that might be the greater danger for Tom Watson.
He says, of course, that people made allegations and he felt he had a moral duty to follow them up, and that's what he's been doing. But
but they weren't new, and the way that he did it, if you say it in PMQs, Prime Minister's Questions, you're saying it on live television, you're letting social media pick up the baton. It was that kind of choreography that he now stands accused of
whipping up.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Susanna, let's move on to something else then. Now, this is a story about Michael Gove and prisons.
It says that Michael Gove met a former prisoner in Dallas, Texas, and that this man who has a criminal background and what have you has convinced Michael Gove that we should move away from the idea that you punish prisoners and that leads to results, that actually it's about rehabilitation, it's about getting people out of prison.
Softer, gentler Michael Gove.
And
his speech at the Conservative Party conference was notably centrist and in a lot of its language almost left-leaning, I thought.
Well, it was very much a different approach to his Conservative predecessors in that role. If you go back to the days of Michael Howard, he was much more about prison works.
Yes.
Michael Gove seems to be moving much more towards the idea that actually you can get people back out into the community, and that's certainly in this article it talks about this Texan prisoner who he's met and that he's been inspired
transformed,
by.
a bit like Ian Duncan Smith on the housing estates of
He's been out there,
Glasgow.
he's met them, he's seen
and
what
Ian
it's
Birrell,
about.
the reporter there, is one of the top reporters we have at the moment, so I would trust him. Now, this is the first time, of course, the Sunday papers have had a chance to pick over David Cameron's conference speech, Fraser.
It is, and I went first to the Observer, who I thought would, being a left-leaning paper, would be rather mean about him. They have asked a whole bunch of people, can you take on face value the Conservatives' shift to the centre or to the left? When David Cameron talks about compassion and fighting poverty, when Michael Gove gives you this new softer side, are they genuine? Is there substance behind it? Now, to my surprise, the consensus from the people they ask seems to be yes. This actually is backed up now with things that are happening for real.
Because you could equally say that here is a Prime Minister taking us towards a referendum which might leave us leaving the EU, overseeing really very, very tough benefit cuts, that what they're doing is they're talking centrist, or talking even centre-left, but acting right.
Yes, exactly. Is this a giant's con? But if you look at the evidence, I mean, right now the poorest have done the best from the last 5 years and the richest have done the worst. It is progressive, to use that beloved word of the left. I mean, David Cameron has actually got quite impressive progressive credentials. And of course, he right now is making a pitch for Labour voters. This isn't so much to do with the referendum. He's thinking, well, if Labour Party is in disarray, maybe we can go and pick up the voters that will be turning away from him, the voters that Blair got in such numbers. It seems to be rather effective so far.
And we heard that message also from George Osborne during the conference, going for that centre ground.
Let's move to two figures of yesteryear. You've got a story there in the column by Barbara Ellen in The Observer about Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, it's a story about Margaret Thatcher, and it's Charles Moore's biography, official biography of Margaret Thatcher, and it talks about how she regretted not giving her children, Mark and Carol, enough time when she was Prime Minister, so not giving them that one-to-one time
And
that
Carol's
you'd want as a
spoken
child.
about this herself, hasn't
She has spoken
Yes.
about it, how, you know, Mummy wasn't around, you know, she wasn't there when she was growing up. And certainly everyone who knows about Margaret Thatcher knows that she was somebody who was very focused on her work. She, you know, it's well known that she read her notes well into the night, and it was somebody who was very much, you know, working full time. So it talks about that, you know, parents perhaps feeling guilty that they don't spend enough time with their children.
Quite right. And there she is again with Geoffrey Howe, the other figure that everyone's talking about, Fraser. Of course, today I was mentioning him with Ken Clarke.
Yes, Geoffrey Howe, who passed away yesterday. A lot of the papers have got obituaries of him, and remember him not for having finished off Thatcher. Over the last few years, people have associated him with that final killer blow to the Iron Lady. But he's being remembered now for being the Chancellor who came up with very tough budget cuts right at the very start of Thatcher's prime ministership, which everybody thought wouldn't work. 364 economists said they wouldn't work, and it turned out to have done so. And
it's one of the great vindication stories of modern British politics, certainly from the Conservatives' point of view.
It is, yes, and funnily enough, I mean, Geoffrey Howe has always been one of George Osborne's heroes. I remember George Osborne saying, you know, way before the 2010 election, that he wanted his budgets to be remembered in the same way that Howe's were, so that he would bite the bullets first off. Of course, I don't think he did to the same extent, but he always had a lodestar. You wouldn't really think.
That's interesting. That's a sort of psychological motivation underpinning the current Chancellor. Now, the biggest cultural event by far of the last week was, of course, National Poetry Day on Radio 4. However, inexplicably and weirdly, the papers seem more interested in Bake Off. And the winner of Bake Off, Suzanne.
Well, I watched Bake Off, and it was just one of those key moments, I think, in TV history. We're all watching it, you know, it had millions of viewers, and you had Nadia creating that wedding cake with the sari theme around it, that best of British. And
she's become a national heroine.
She really has, yeah. And so we've got here in the Sunday Telegraph, it talks about how she says she had to kick her husband out of the kitchen. You know, she's somebody who's got young children, she's a mum, she's throughout the whole of the series she was somebody who, you know, came up with lots of witty lines and people really warmed to her. She's from a Bangladeshi background, all of that, you know, she's very much about multicultural Britain, and certainly a lot of papers have been talking about, you know, her as this British heroine now.
And it's funny, when she won it, she sort of tearfully said, now I feel I can do anything with my life. So what's the first thing she does? Kicks her husband out of the kitchen. You know? I feel a bit sorry for the poor. I'm sure his omelets aren't that bad.
Husbands all over will be stung by that. Susana Mendonça, you've been an absolute heroine, coming in right at the last minute. True professional. Fraser, thanks for keeping us going as well. That's been great. Now, it's a year since the Scots rejected independence, but the result of the referendum only seems to have strengthened the SNP, almost sweeping the board in Scotland in the general election and enjoying a huge surge in membership. But everything is not entirely rosy. Next year, the party has to defend its record in the Scottish parliamentary election.